Elaine Imbruglia, president at Modica Associates, discusses all things ecological and environmental and the impacts on your property. We hope you enjoy.
In Our Expert Opinion podcast is brought to you by SVN Saunders Ralston Dancer Real Estate, a full-service land and commercial brokerage with almost $4 billion in transactions since 1996.
Okay, we are back. I am the host, Linda Schultz, and I'm joined by my co-host, my official co-host, Chad Mills. Hi. If he can turn on his mic.
Oh, yeah. Having all kinds of issues.
Chad and I have not filmed or recorded in 2 months, so this is basically like we're starting over, and it's been a blast for 2 hours trying to get everything set back up.
Studio set up.
Yeah.
Had other stuff going on in this room, so
yeah.
Had to break it all down.
It's
new desk.
Trials and tribulations of the studio. And I am joined by the very popular, at least in our office, everybody was clamoring to come over here and talk to you, Elaine Imbruglia. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Did I say your last name right?
You did.
Okay.
Thank you. Very nice.
I only had to say it 18 times in my head to try to get it right.
Me too, still.
And so you spoke at our land conference about gopher tortoises, and you are an environmental consultant with Modica Associates, right?
Yes.
And you're the president?
Yes.
I want to say? Okay. Did you start the company?
I did not. My business partner, Jim Modica, started the company in 1989.
Wow.
And I joined him almost 20 years ago.
Wow.
Yes.
And did you know when you were little that you wanted to become an environmental consultant?
I had no idea, although I liked to make mud pies when I was little. No, I studied biological sciences in school, and I didn't even know environmental consulting was a career or an option.
Yeah. I mean, you know, when you Google it, all of these things come up about just so many different avenues that an environmental consultant can take and everything that entails. But I believe that you are like the expert on, now Jennifer said it was like birds and bunnies, but I don't know what that means.
So a lot of people call what we do bugs and bunnies.
Bugs and bunnies, that's what it was.
And it's, it's a difficult thing. A lot of people say what we do is environmental consulting. Mm-hmm. Really, it's ecological consulting.
Okay.
Environmental tends to be more toward, the chemistry side or phase ones, and we don't do any of that. We do focus on the bugs and bunnies, as they're called. So the wetlands and the wildlife, more of the ecology aspect.
And so you said you majored in biology?
Yes, biological sciences.
Okay. And when we talked the other day, you said you went to Mississippi State?
I did. Go Bulldogs. Hail State.
I have heard those words many times over the years. I had a good friend who went to Mississippi State, and I went to a couple of games. So very familiar with the cowbell, as I told you. Have a little PTSD maybe still ringing in my ears from that.
Yes. Going to a game at Mississippi State is glorious. There's nothing like the sound of those cowbells.
I would agree. I will totally agree with you on that. So you majored in biology, and then do you have a master's in biological sciences as well?
Yes.
Okay.
I wasn't quite ready for the real world after my BS, so I stayed for a master's. And then when I finished that, I sent my resume literally everywhere across the United States, Arizona, Oregon. I didn't know what I wanted to do or what was available. And I actually ended up with an internship with the Nature Conservancy at the Disney Wilderness Preserve.
Where is, here in Florida?
Yes, that's down in like the Poinciana area of Florida.
And what were you doing there?
I had an independent study on the Disney Wilderness Preserve, that's a mitigation bank basically for Disney and their development. Oh. And so I did an independent study and helped with wetland monitoring and reporting for that preserve.
And then after that, you joined Modica?
Well, after that, I actually went into private consulting for a different firm, and then I worked for South Florida Water Management District for several years, and then after that is when I joined Modica.
We are very familiar with Swift Mud around here.
Yes.
So, part of the reason that, a big reason that we wanted you on the podcast is because we have so many property owners and sellers and buyers who I think that your line of work really, they need somebody like you in order to come in and look at their land and tell them what to do, basically. If there's an issue, and by issue I mean if there's any type of ecological issue. I know that it can kind of kill a deal sometimes if there's something on the property that shouldn't be, or that is on the property that has always been there. And so this can be a major factor in a part of due diligence and, development with our property owners and buyers. So I just kind of wanted to get into a little bit of that and your experience, and maybe some funny stories along the way if you have any. But, with our land side, even with our commercial side, we have properties that we sell for development, or properties for investment. And so when the buyers come along and they put a contract down on a property, they have to do some due diligence. And I think that is where you come in. And so do you want to go into a little bit, about what you do whenever you get onto a property?
Sure. And you're exactly right. And we're usually one of the first consultants to start the due diligence process, because of a lot of what we do in the field then needs to be picked up by surveyors or considered by engineers when a potential buyer is in the due diligence process. So we, in that process, we look at old historic aerials and consider existing information on that property, and then we go out and do the field work. And we'll delineate wetlands or look for bald eagles or caracara or sand skinks or gopher tortoises or the myriad species that we must consider here in Florida. And then we write a report for any potential buyer, and we outline any concerns about that they should consider, like wetland impacts, cost of mitigation, cost of tortoise relocation, restrictions if there's a bald eagle nest for the management zone, and all of those types of things that they should consider while they develop their potential site plan.
With wetlands, so in-house here, we have a mapping program where we can pretty much see where the wetlands are. We have wetlands maps, but why would how does that impact buyers and or property owners in general? I know that you can't build a house on quicksand, basically, or, you cannot go into the middle of a lake and build a house. It's not going to be okay in the long run.
Right.
So how do you, what all does that entail? I know that there are wetlands already, outlined, but how do people know?
Well, and that's the interesting thing too, because a lot of people will look at aerials and they'll say, okay, well, here are the wetlands. But there's a little misnomer about wetlands, because I think a lot of people think that wetlands are the cypress domes or the bay swamps or the floodplains that are obviously a swamp, like what you would picture in your head when you think of a swamp or a bayou. But there are many wetlands out there that may not appear as wetland on an aerial because they're not constantly holding water. They may hold water seasonally, but when they do the aerial photography, it's not going to pick up maybe during that wet season. And so you can't just go by aerials. And sometimes they're tricky in the field because you can delineate it just on soils, or soils and vegetation, and not necessarily water. And it's important because if you purchase a piece of property, whether you're a single-family landowner or you're purchasing thousands of acres, you have to know what those limitations are. And a lot of times with wetlands come floodplains, and you have to consider the floodplain impacts as well. And so you can impact wetlands and you can provide mitigation, but to your point, you can't, with some of the deeper marsh areas where you have thick muck, you have to demuck and fill and that has a cost to it as well. So all of those considerations have to be considered when you're going to develop a piece of land with wetlands.
Is there any type of animal that lives in a wetland that is protected that would prevent somebody from mitigating wetlands?
That's a good question. There are, sometimes you can have bird rookeries, and oddly, the alligator is protected, but only because of its similarity to crocodiles, which are protected. So, and wood storks. So there are several species of wildlife that you have to consider that may live in wetlands. But a lot of times your mitigation credit that you would purchase at a mitigation bank covers the impact of those species as well.
Oh, I did not realize that. How does that work? Do they relocate these birds and alligators or what?
No. For example, the wood stork wetlands are considered suitable foraging habitat. So it provides habitat for them to forage. And so when you impact the wetland, that forage goes away. But you're purchasing credits at a wetland mitigation bank that then replaces that foraging habitat. So it's the same thing as wetland mitigation. You're impacting it in your development area, but you're providing mitigation at an alternate site.
This is so foreign to me, but it does make sense. When did all of that start? Being able to purchase, has this always been around?
So it has in different forms. Even since the 1980s, back before we had environmental resource permits, there were MSSW permits, which were surface water permits. And the delineation of wetlands has changed over time. It used to be just basically the cypress edge, and you would walk by a lot of the wet prairies and things that are considered wetlands today. So it's been a changing landscape since the 80s, but the mitigation has always been there in some form. It used to be more common to do on-site mitigation, whether that's preservation of wetlands that you're not impacting or wetland creation, but it's more common now to have the wetland mitigation banks. And a lot of developers prefer that because it's kind of a pay and go. You buy the credits, you meet you satisfy your permit conditions, and then you're done.
What do the credits go toward? Toward creating new habitats for these,
So the banks, every wetland mitigation bank is different, but they're usually large tracts of lands and thousands of acres. And it can be wetland preservation, upland enhancement, wetland creation or restoration, whether you ditch, block old agricultural ditches to rehydrate wetlands that have been drained for years. So every bank has a different program.
Oh my goodness.
It's a lot.
I feel like that is all of Florida, is one big wetland at some time or another.
That is true.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of our property owners run into some form of wetlands, and if you don't, then I would probably consider yourself very lucky.
Well, if you don't, you're on the ridge and you've got to worry about gopher tortoises and sand skinks. So there's no get out of jail free card in Florida.
There's always something. Okay.
Yes.
The sand skinks, though. I think I told you this on the phone, that my mom would always be like, "That's a skink. Don't touch that." And I have no idea what she was talking about. It's just this black lizard-looking thing. But when we were talking, those are not the...
They're not sand skinks. Those are skinks, but they're not sand skinks.
Yes. I've never seen a sand skink a day in my life. I Googled it. I doubt I ever will. What are they? What are these little guys doing?
So they're small, legless lizards that swim through sand.
They do look like snakes a little bit.
They do. They look like little miniature snakes.
Yeah.
And they only live on the central ridges of Florida.
Okay.
And that's why they're protected. They're federally protected. And
can I ask though, what do they provide? I feel this way about mosquitoes, but I guess fish eat mosquitoes. I don't know what it is, but what are they, why are they important?
Well, I don't know that they're important, but they're protected on a federal level because they only occur on the sandy ridges in the peninsula of Florida. They're nowhere else in the world except here. And so
lucky us.
Right. So that's why they're protected, is there's a limited population, not only in Florida, but in the United States or the world. And so
they pose a problem because if they're on your land, you're not able to develop there, or what is the deal?
You can. So we do a survey and determine whether you have sand skinks present or not. If you do, you can apply for what's called an incidental take permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And that allows you to go ahead and develop the land, but we're back to the mitigation. So for every acre of occupied habitat that you impact, you purchase 2 credits or 2 acres at a conservation bank. So everything that we do is kind of a balance between you're going to impact something, but you have to provide mitigation and replace what you're impacting.
You got to pay to play.
Yes.
Someone has to pay.
Yes.
That is what, so, I mean, do they die if you're building on the land, or do they just?
So that's probably not a popular topic, but typically with incidental take permits, that covers the landowner or developer in case something happens to an animal, and you can, or a protected species, and you can get incidental take permits that cover bald eagles, sandhill cranes, sand skinks, and other species. And usually, obviously, if it's a flightless species that has wings and can fly, then that species may persist. But in the case of a sand skink, they can't really escape the bulldozer. So unfortunately, they
Interesting.
don't make it
out
the other side.
That is wild. And so I asked you this just right before we started recording, but I've done mostly leasing. The sales that I have done are a commercial building that's been already there, for years. How would someone know that they needed to hire you to look for a sand skink?
And that's a good question. And certainly, and we talked briefly about this, but if you're not local and if you're not from Florida, you don't know a lot of the regulations or protections that cover property. And that can be on the federal level, the state level, or the local level. A lot of municipalities, counties, and cities have local ordinances that protect not only the species, but the habitat that they live in. And so hopefully those people understand to talk with someone like yourself who's educated in that, or their engineer. But a lot of times they may not know, and especially on a single family homeowner, even if it's a 5-acre lot, they may be alerted to this when they go to their local municipality for a building permit, or a plat, or a lot split, that kind of thing. Then that organization's going to ask them for, well, where's your wetland line? Did you consider sand skinks, or do you have tortoises?
I feel like probably this has come up a lot recently because there have been so many, I don't want to say foreign, but I think technically if you're from a different state, it's even like a foreign transaction. I know if you create a foreign entity, I mean, it could be in Georgia, so I'll use the term foreigner loosely here, but I feel like, I mean, if you're coming from Alabama, you're coming from Utah, I would not know that these are even issues, so it's, I feel like that's quite a surprise for investors whenever they're not from here. If you don't know what you don't know. And so I feel like they probably get hit with these things and it's like, what are you talking about? I mean, the word skink alone is like, it sounds made up.
It's an interesting predicament that we're in, because you're right. We'll get phone calls from people from Minnesota, and they say, well, we hear something about skanks. I'm like, well, first of all, it's a skink, not a skank. But trying to explain what we do to people that, don't understand. And it is kind of funny sometimes, and it can be scary too for them, because they just hear the restrictions and they don't understand that there could potentially be a way through it.
I mean, they're spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to develop land or to invest in land. And the thought of it not being usable is, first of all, that'd be very bad for any investor or owner, buyer. So I just think that, I don't know, it's a little bit scary.
It is, and also the timing is a difficult thing to discuss as well, because when you're dealing with a federally protected species, it can take a long time to get the permit. But, and that's where we come in to explain to the potential developer or buyer that you can start development maybe on a portion of the land while you wait for your federal permits to be processed. So it's important that, and that's something that we do as a company, stay very engaged with any regulatory changes and build relationships with the people who enforce those regulations so we can better guide our clients on what's available to them, how do we keep them moving, because like you said, it's a big investment and time is money.
Yeah. Do the regulations change often?
They do.
Oh.
Both on the state and the federal level. They're always changing survey protocols or as they get new research on different species. So it's something that we have to keep current with.
Yeah. So you mentioned, I hope I say it right, Cara?
Yes.
Is that it? I thought it was an eagle. It's not an eagle.
It's not an eagle.
It looks more like a hawk, I think, than an eagle.
It's a raptor.
Okay. What's a raptor? Other than a truck. I know what a Ford Raptor is.
That's good.
But I don't know, is that a...
It's a type of bird that's a predator.
Okay.
Yes, and so it's similar to an eagle or a hawk.
Okay.
And some people may confuse it with an osprey because it kind of has that black and white
appearance. It does look like an osprey.
But it has a crested head.
My brother once said, look, there's a sea spray. And I'm like, what is that? I called it that for 5 years. I thought he knew what he was talking about. He was 8, that's what I get for listening to an 8-year-old. But are these are federally protected birds, or are they?
They are.
Okay.
They're federally protected. And they like to nest in singular cabbage palms in pastures and open lands. And they're more common in South Florida, but it seems like they're becoming a little more prominent as far as us having to do surveys and consider them even up into Polk Osceola and sometimes Brevard Volusia for sure.
Do you think that has to do with all of the development down there or in South Florida, or do you think they're just naturally coming up here?
No, I think it's because as we develop more land, we're encountering more caracara or other species that have to be considered. It's just a sign of development. The larger tracts of lands and the larger pastures are being now considered for development, and that's when you have to start considering everything that could be there, and caracara is one of them.
So what does that mean to have a federally protected animal? It doesn't have to be a caracara. You can't, and you had mentioned that there is I think a large radius around them, or maybe that's just eagles, I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's a protection radius or a management zone that should be considered for caracara as well as eagles. And caracara are commonly on agricultural properties, and those are compatible uses. So you asked, what implication does that have on properties? If they're on agricultural lands, that's completely fine. They persist well in agricultural properties. It's when you consider the land use change, that's when you have to start considering how do we protect them? Do we need to consider an incidental take permit? Is there a mitigation option? And that's when you start talking with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to see what your options are.
Will they remove the bird and kind of rehome them, or?
You don't, not in that
Okay.
sense, but on large tracts of lands, you usually would have certain areas that you set aside for conservation, and that's why it's important to have somebody like us, an ecological consultant, to come in up front to have a plan. Okay, we know these are our limitations. We've got wetlands here, we have a caracara here. We know we can't develop this area, so we're going to make this into a long-term preservation conservation area. We're going to have to impact this caracara habitat, but there's suitable habitat over here, so the plan is that we would kind of impact their habitat as we go, and that will encourage them to move over to the preserved side of the property. In theory.
Yeah, I was
doesn't
going to say,
always
does
work
that work?
But
do they cooperate?
And sometimes they do, and that's something that you would negotiate with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and put a plan, and that often includes land management plan.
Okay.
So you manage that land for that species in the post-development condition.
So when these developers or buyers, they have to, if they have a caracara on their land, they would have to designate a section of the land in order to like preserve that species?
They may. It depends on how big the property is, what their habitat is. And, if it's a smaller piece of property and maybe the caracara are known to just forage there, then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service may ask for a voluntary contribution to their conservation fund.
Okay.
Which is always interesting to tell the developers it's a voluntary contribution.
How much is it?
No, but that's the $1 million question. Nobody knows. You just kind of have to make it up and see it.
Oh my goodness.
It's not a large number though. It's
Our listeners are going to realize how not smart I am by the questions that I'm asking today.
Listen, I've understood two things. It's mud pies and college football so far in this podcast.
Well, we can go back to that.
Yes. Chad and I probably will.
I did have a question, though. You said that the caracaras are coming up into Osceola, Volusia, Polk. Could that possibly be as well population density increasing? I mean, if we've been protecting them well, is the population growing? I obviously know that their development south has pushed them further north, but you said that they like to live in single what?
Cabbage
palm
palms.
heads. So do they are they dominant on their domain where there can only be one for every square mile?
Yeah, so
and
yes,
so
they're
the density will
territorial.
push them? Okay.
They are territorial. That's a good question. And if I said they're moving up into Osceola, Brevard, and Volusia, I may have misspoken. They've always been there, and it's kind of like we touched on earlier. It's just that we're now encroaching into those areas where they may have been for
Forever,
years,
yeah.
But they've persisted with agricultural management for so long. But now that we're considering development in these areas, we have to consider the impact of that species.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I may have heard that wrong, but I'm running a bunch of different
Chad's calculating over there.
Yeah.
No, it is interesting though, because I wonder, have they been protected so well that now there's so many more than what there were before?
I honestly don't know the answer to that.
I don't know.
But I do feel like it's more of we're encroaching into
Yeah.
areas that have never been considered for development before. So I don't know much about the existing population or if it's increased, over the last couple of decades. I don't know.
Yeah. My parents live in Volusia County, and I know just in the past 2 to 3 years, there have been thousands and thousands of acres purchased to be developed for single-family residential homes. So, and I mean, these are deep woods, back there. So I can imagine, and even though I've never seen one before, it doesn't mean that they haven't been there the whole time. It's not exactly like I'm looking up all the time.
And that's, it's not something that the normal person would consider.
Yeah.
Because, this is what I do. So I'm driving down the road. I'm always looking up. I'm looking on the top of telephone poles. And I'm like, well, there's a bald eagle. I wonder how many people have actually seen that or, bother to look. But it's something that kind of is ingrained with me now because this is what I do. So.
What is your... I don't want to say like every single day, but you're out in the field, right? You're like on properties.
Yes.
What does that look like whenever you get out there?
So this is a very interesting career because some days I'm dressed nicely like this, or I have meetings with regulatory agencies or meetings with land developers, and other days I am in snake boots, in the
like
heat.
waders, yeah.
Well, no, just the snake boots and the heat and moisture of, August in Florida, carrying a machete. You can see that I'm all torn up from blackberry. We get ticks. I've had a snake fall on my head.
What kind of snake? It doesn't matter, but I do want to know, what kind of snake was it?
Well, to be honest, I think it was a rat snake. But I threw it and screamed and ran the other way, so I wasn't going to check. Oh my God. But it was in a cabbage palm frond, and I had pushed it away, and the snake fell on the snake was coiled up in that frond, and it fell right on top of my head. It was very exciting.
I would be like a fainting goat. I would have passed out immediately right on the spot. I don't care. I
totally understand.
do not mess with most creatures, but definitely no snakes.
Well, so our day in the field is not glamorous. It's hot and sweaty.
Yeah.
We encounter all kinds of snakes. I've stepped on a cottonmouth. I've pulled up a rattlesnake out of a tortoise burrow before. So it can be a little dangerous, but it's fun. It's always challenging, and it definitely keeps you in shape.
Well, I mean, in Florida, I'm sweating just walking to my car from
Yes.
this building, and I park directly outside of the door. It's maybe 4 feet. But Florida's brutal.
It is brutal, and we're out in it for
Yeah.
10 hours a day in the 95-degree heat with the humidity, so it's tough.
Yeah. So whenever you get out to the properties, you know, how do you find a sand skink?
So that there's a survey protocol.
Okay.
And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service puts out that protocol, and you throw out 2 foot by 2 foot plywood cover boards that are 1/2 inch thick, and you put them typically at a density of 40 cover boards per acre, but that can vary depending on the habitat. And then you have to go back and check those boards weekly for 4 consecutive weeks. And you look for because you don't normally see a sand skink.
Yes.
You look for the track that they leave in the sand. And if you find their track, then you know that you've got sand skinks. I'm not making them up.
For some reason, I was expecting there to be some sort of technology involved.
No. A lot of what we do. A lot of what we do is like, I don't know, somehow kind of MacGyvered
It
together.
is. It's like your mud pies. You're
Yes.
just kind of making mud pies.
You just make it up what
Yeah.
works in the field, and so that
That
works.
is wild. Also, 4 weeks is a long time.
It is. So the entire survey takes 5 weeks.
Okay.
And that survey can only be done between March 1st and May 15 of any year. So if you've got a piece
What?
of property that has to consider sand skinks, you have to kind of know it in advance and
What?
hope you meet that
Why
window.
is this? Why is that window there?
That's their breeding season.
Okay.
And so this is according to the regulations and the,
Okay.
and the research that exists on the species.
That could really hold up a deal.
It absolutely can. And it's been a deal killer, not because we found them, but because people don't have time
Yeah.
to know the answer.
If you put a property under contract in September, I mean, who wants to wait
Right.
until you said March?
March 1st.
That's wild.
But it's also important for anybody who's, listening to this as an educational purpose, that not every project has to consider sand skinks. It's limited to the
Yeah.
Central Florida or the Central Ridges. It's limited to certain soil types. And a lot of times, even if you meet those criteria, the property may be exempt from sand skink survey requirements because it's dense pasture grasses or something else that would preclude the sand skink from moving through the soils.
From wanting to be there.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
Okay.
sometimes you may meet all the criteria, that's the location, the soil types, and the elevation, but the habitat's not suitable, and so we can get
Yeah.
exemptions.
Yeah.
from that.
Yeah.
So.
It's kind of like assumed that they're not going to be an issue there. Have you encountered any alligators on your?
Yes. Yes.
It's a nightmare of mine.
I've been up, in my chest waders doing wetland monitoring, and I'll see an alligator kind of coming toward me, and I'll look at the lone pine tree and, wonder, can I get there quicker than the alligator and shimmy up it? Or like
A pine tree, I feel like, at my parents' house, it's like all pines. One would think that they'd be easy to climb, but they're really not.
No, and of course that's
But
not
in a
an
moment
option.
like that, you have enough adrenaline going through your mind,
Well, and that's what your mind is going to think. Well, me anyway. There are a lot of people that do what we do have a calm demeanor, and they're not going to freak out if a snake falls on their head or if there's an alligator 10 feet.
So
from
I
them,
will not be able to be an environmental or
Not in your future.
no.
Yes.
I also don't camp, just for anybody wondering.
You got quite a bit working against you.
I really do.
No, we've got spiders and ticks and everything that is not pleasant we deal with daily. Yes.
It's just very. I feel like. Are you one of 100? Because I feel like there's not that many people that are,
A lot of people don't realize that that's a lot of what we do is the hot field work, and
Yeah.
it's not pleasant. not dissimilar from what surveyors do.
That's true.
And we're even there before surveyors, so they haven't even cut their nice lines with the machetes. And sometimes we're so lazy, we just kind of crawl through the vegetation rather than cutting a line. So, but it's not for everyone.
Yeah.
And, it's a tough career.
But it does sound like a lot of fun.
It is fun. It has its moments.
Yeah. And I feel like there's a ton of good stories in that. And, Chad's stories he doesn't encounter alligators, but he does encounter, I guess you do on that property that I had in Fort Meade. You did.
I've encountered 2 this week.
Well, I feel like you encounter more angry property owners. I was going to say they might even be a little bit worse than the alligators sometimes.
Sometimes.
So yeah, I guess you do encounter alligators. Have you ever had
eagles?
Have you ever had Okay, Chad has a good. It's with the drone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Entertaining. I don't know if it's good for a drone pilot to lose a drone due to a bald eagle. Had no idea there was one in the area. Apparently it had a nest in a cell tower, and I was flying past the cell tower, and I guess it heard it, saw it, and I was too close to its nest, tacked the drone 400 feet, dropped out of the air, spent like an hour and a half looking for the battery. Battery completely detached from the drone. So found the drone, battery was 60 yards away. It hit like multiple trees, bounced. Yeah, that was one of 2 eagle stories. Both cell towers.
Right, yeah, that's a good story, but actually, you brought up drones, and that's actually a tool that we use now.
Oh, is it?
For, to look for sandhill crane nests, to determine if their osprey nest is active or not. So they definitely have their uses, but we haven't had one attacked by an eagle yet. That's pretty good.
I think it's coming. I think it's just a matter of time. But I remember when that happened, it was a couple of years ago, and like all of the little propellers on the drone were broken, and that eagle was not happy to see Chad's drone up there.
No.
What was I gonna shoot? I was gonna ask a question, and now I can't even remember.
You're just thankful that there's people like Elaine that you can hire, that you don't have to go do
I
this.
am thankful for that. I am. Because there was one property that I worked on in Fort Meade, and Chad also worked on it, and there are some of the biggest alligators I've ever seen in my life. And I do not mess around with that. I have nightmares about these things chasing me. They're terrifying.
Well, you'll appreciate this story then. We've got one of the other things that we do is in the post-development condition, we do wetland monitoring. If we've used on-site wetlands as mitigation, the water management districts require that you monitor and maintain those wetlands to a certain success criteria. And so we have to go out and do that monitoring. One of our staff was doing the monitoring, and the wetland was behind him, and he felt something nip on his ankle, and he turned around, and it was an alligator, and it actually grabbed him and flipped him over and was dragging him into the wetland. It turned out fine. I don't know if I can share how this was dealt with, but he's fine, but the alligator was taken care of. Well, you asked for funny stories. I don't know if that's funny.
But I mean, was he in the hospital?
No, he was completely fine. We wear boots that are pretty protective. So the alligator he didn't break skin or anything. I feel like you're going to pass out.
I feel like I am going to pass out. I will probably dream about that tonight. I don't like it.
Like I said, it's a dangerous job sometimes.
I would be hyper paranoid. Every 2 seconds, I'd be looking over my shoulder, wondering what was going to.
Linda, you're already that way.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Jen.
There's no alligators in the buildings that you're leasing.
Well, there is an alligator in the building. Didn't you see it when you walked in?
Oh, in this
I
one,
did
yeah.
see it.
It's a full-grown alligator in this building.
I did see
and
it.
I don't really look at it because I don't even want to acknowledge that it's there. I remembered what I was going to ask you. You said sandhill cranes, right?
Yes. You know the big birds
Oh,
with the
I
red
know.
cap? Okay.
Because I feel like they are around these lakes. Is this right?
Yes.
And they don't care. They will stand dead in the middle of traffic and cause a backup around Lake Hollingsworth or Lake Morton. this is them, right?
Yes, they're pretty low key.
They do not care. If you beep your horn at them, they don't care.
Well, they were here first. But
they're everywhere.
They are, and a lot of times they're somewhat domesticated because people feed them, which is illegal, and you're not supposed to feed them. So they'll be in people's backyards. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of homes are built around wetlands, and this is where the sandhill cranes nest, and people like them. They're interesting.
I feel like they're always on a golf course.
Oh, yeah, they love
always on a golf
That's
course.
That's a great food source for them.
Really? Why? What do they eat?
You've seen them as they forage in the ground. So any grubs or the bugs that live in the ground.
Bugs and bunnies, except not bunnies. And so I guess just one last question here is, why are wetlands important?
Well, that's kind of a difficult question to answer, but the easy answer is they provide natural water storage, flood protection, and water quality improvement. So
they're important.
Yes, they are important.
And habitats.
Yes, and wildlife habitat, of course.
Important to Florida, if not all of Florida.
Yes.
So, okay. Well, I really appreciate you coming on today. Thank you so much for your time. You have been a wealth of knowledge, and I see why everybody was clamoring to kick down the studio door to talk to you. I hope this wasn't too painful for your first podcast.
No, I appreciate the opportunity, and it was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Chad.
Absolutely.
All right, guys, enjoy.